So what were the hurdles this week? What were the big ones? Ego, yeah. hmm Mine was responsibility. Um, Jess called me out appropriately on. I blamed Julie for something. Shocker. Hey, Juju. Um, but like those things continually get in our way for making sure that we have that right output and ownership mentality, and those are important to be mindful of. So for our last little installment here, we're going to talk about turning problems into progress because owners really consider problems over little moments of importance, right? So, really, really easy when you're not thinking like an owner to see a problem and be like, not my responsibility, or I'm not going to handle that, or I don't have the authority to do that. And I want to talk about a couple of things today. Number one is why do we think that way? Why do we have that mindset when it comes to problems? And number two, what do we do about it? So, why do most of us just see problems? Well, it starts with understanding that we have a negativity bias. So, I've talked about this in morning report a couple times, but we are programmed as human beings to see negative issues, right? So picture yourself back in like the caveman tribal days. You walk out of your cave in the morning, right? Think about the positive Polly, right? Maybe this name wasn't Polly, I don't know, but he looks around, she looks around, oh, what a great day. Gosh, it's just such an honor to be alive. Walks around, sees like, oh, look at this berry, it looks delicious. I eat it, I die because it was poison, right? Or I walk over here, oh, pretty saber-toothed tiger, good kitty, dead, right? So in a tribal mentality or in a very early human development, if you had a negativity bias, you probably had a higher chance of survival. So you were programmed evolutionarily to look and see, okay, if there's something that's going to kill me, I better identify it. Otherwise, muerto, right? Spanish for dead. And that's why we're programmed that way to think that way. And honestly, we can allow worry to consume much of what we do to avoid problems, but altogether, most of the time, since we identify it, we'll learn to push it down. If I just avoid it, don't think about it, because of that natural predisposition, then I might not ever get over it. And I love this quote by Henry Ford, but most people spend more time and energy going around problems than actually trying to solve them. And it's really a mindset shift. I want you to start thinking that problems aren't necessarily happening to us, they're happening through us, right? It's an opportunity to change the outcome. There was a really, to illustrate our negativity bias, there was a really interesting study performed testing something called an inequity aversion. So inequity, not equal, aversion, I don't want it. Inequity aversion. It's called the ultimatum game. You should try this with your friends sometime. Get two people, and person A gets a sum of money. In the study, they gave them $100. And the game was, if person A divided it to the liking of person B, then both people got to walk away with all the money. So, for example, if person A said, I'm splitting it 50-50, highly likely that person B is going to agree with that, right? But when it dropped below 30%, so if person A said, I'm going to give you $25 out of this $100, most of the time, person B was like, no deal. I would rather walk away from any money. Remember, they started with zero. They could have walked away with $25. But the idea that it's not equal, we're not getting the same, person B would prioritize fairness and equality over any kind of gain at all. That's our negativity bias playing into that, right? If you think about it pragmatically, you came into that situation with $0. If you walk away with $25, that's a net gain. But because of the negativity bias that is all within us, we can walk away with nothing. So it's really important to be thinking about that as we begin to understand that negativity is how we're naturally wired. And that's okay. We can use it to our advantage. And it's really important to understand the thing about healthcare workers is that we're trained to uncover problems. We're trained to lean into problems, but unfortunately, currently the healthcare establishment has framed problems as if you bring them up, you're complaining. So just go along to get along. And we're not allowing ourselves to use the same skill set that we've developed in patient care to apply to problems that we encounter in the workforce, because we are the ones that are on the ground floor and engaging and interacting with these problems. So why is it so important in the workplace? Because negativity and positivity significantly impact outcomes from a cultural perspective. So if we start to explore the negativity outcomes in workplace dynamics, we see a very similar trend that you would in any negative culture. And that is teams with negative team members are 54% less productive and 45% more likely to experience employee turnover. So our negativity bias is something we have to acknowledge and understand that it has really bad effects on our work mental health or how we perform as teams. And it's important to understand that. And I think put yourself in any type of negative situation and just, you could be driving down the road, right? And look out to the left or look out to the right and you see a wreck. Think about naturally how interested you are in pausing to see what's going on versus how naturally interested you would be in pausing to watch a sunset, right? Those are two different things that are both interesting to see. If somebody points either one, I'd be like, oh, that's nice. But which one are you more likely to engage in, right? Probably the negative example. And that's a bias that's in each one of us. Or think about it from, if somebody comes up to you in the workplace and says, hey, I've got some really good news I've got some really interesting thing I learned about so-and-so, right? A negative conversation, gossip, something that we can be construed in a bad light of somebody else, that's something that we find appealing. We want to share in that revelry. We want to share in those negative emotions. And the problem is shared struggle, difficulty in relationship, us all having to band together, that can form a lot of bonds. But unfortunately, we can do it inappropriately in the form of negativity. So this is why gossip is so powerful. It's why gossip is so appealing. Because if we're sharing in a complaining atmosphere, if we're sharing in a negative situation, it makes us feel a sense of community, which is a superficial community because it's predicated on something that's not actually sustaining. If you see a difficult project, like, hey, how are we going to solve this together? That's also a semi-negative experience, but you're growing through it. Much more sustaining relationship, which makes burnout in healthcare a huge problem. Because based on those statistics that you just saw, if we don't address the burnout problem, and if we focus on input metrics instead of output metrics, we start putting in more hours, we start putting in more effort, we burn out, and we get negative outcomes. And it leads to 54% less productivity and 45% turnover. So not only is it important to have an ownership mindset for the group, but also for ourselves, so that we don't bring our natural negative bias into the workplace. So I want you to see the contrast here. What's the power of strong performers? What's the power of that positive outcome? Interestingly enough, notice the difference in the numbers here. Teams with strong positive contributors are 31% more productive and 23% more profitable. So the first thing you notice is that positivity is nowhere near as powerful as negativity. And that's because of the original inputs that we talked about. That's not how we were designed. We're designed to protect ourselves, to avoid the negative, to look for things that are bad. We're not designed to search for things that are positive. That's why negative emotions, negative conversations, negative attitudes are much more appealing, and they have a much more negative consequence. There was a similar study done, not in medical settings, but in corporate settings, that if you are seated near a high quality performer or somebody that works really, really hard or has high outcomes, if you're seated near somebody, your productivity goes up by about 25%, regardless of who you are as a performer. If you're seated by a negative person or somebody who has low output, your productivity drops by 45%. So negative people are far more impactful than positive people. And it's important to understand that. It's important to see two things. Number one, if you don't utilize that bias the right way, it's really, really negative. It's really bad. But it's also important to know that that bias exists in us, and it allows us to identify problems regularly. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we handle it? So how do we turn problems into progress? And the number one thing we have to understand is that really it's up to us. It's up to us to choose, if we see a problem, to make the switch. Because we can do coaching, we can do touch points, we can do curriculums, we can have core values. But when it comes to the day-to-day interactions, it's up to us to make the decision that we're going to be positive. We're not going to choose negativity. We're going to choose to be different. And that's, if you think about us as an organization, every one of us are important in that decision-making, right? Leadership can't just do it alone, but every little prong, if you think of like a hairbrush, every little prong on that hairbrush is important, right? One or two go down, it starts to puts more pressure on the little prongs next to it, and then those go down, and the thing starts to fall apart. Every person is important in maintaining the culture. We don't have culture, we are the culture. So how do we do it specifically? I'm going to give you a couple examples. I'm going to give you a little stepwise process, 3 steps in turning all of those problems into progress. Number 1, core value, see it, own it. And I mean that in the sense of the word. I want you to see a problem, and I want it to be like live in your brain rent-free. I'll tell you a story. One of my see it, I can't forget it kind of stories. When I was in 5th or 6th grade, I can't remember, I had this PE coach, wonderful, jolly man. He actually did Santa Claus a lot because he had kind of long gray hair and a long white beard and a kind of a jolly belly. That's kind of a nice way of saying it. He would tuck his T-shirt into his jeans, and he loved volleyball and dodgeball. So we played dodgeball and volleyball and PE every day. And in 5th grade, that was tons of fun. Loved that. And I had high respect for this guy because, you know, if you're in elementary school, any teacher that's all about fun is going to be your favorite, right? So I'm at a church event one weekend on a Saturday at a park, and they have a pavilion. Ever been to a church event? They're all grilling burgers or whatever. I'm eating my hot dog. I notice Coach over there, not part of our group, part of a different group. I walk up, and as I get closer, I notice he's wearing some metallic pants and also a shiny garb. And I start to come up to him, and as I'm getting close to him, he takes a head covering which has a beak on it and a lot of feathers behind it and puts it over his face. And I say his name, won't say his name. I say, "Hey, Coach so-and-so," and he looks at me with a panicked look on his face. And he's dressed like a bird, what I thought was a bird. And he exclaimed in a certain tone, "I am so-and-so," long Latin name, half dragon, half man. And then he flew out into the field and engaged with a bunch of other people who were dressed just like him in sword combat. Have you guys heard of LARP, live action role playing? So, not knocking LARP at all, love LARP players. It's a very interesting event. But once I saw this man dressed like a dragon, it's something I could never unsee. And every time we'd play volleyball, I'd be like, "Who are you today? Who are you today?" And he always had this like weird look because he knew that I knew, you know? I know who you really are. And I want you to have that mentality toward problems. I want you to see it on. I want to give you permission to do something about it. Because a lot of times we see something and we think, there's nothing I can do about that. I don't have the authority. Or there's already been too many changes. Or if I say this, we'll have that bias, I'll just be complaining, right? I want you to lean into owning it. And everything from the little things, from like, the wall's got a scuff on it. I'm going to own that. I may not be the one that fixes it, but I'm going to make sure it gets communicated to the right person. Or the camera's not working in room blankety blank. Okay, well, I'm going to own that problem. I'm going to make sure it gets communicated. I'm going to keep following up with it until I know that something's being done about it, right? Because remember, it's on all of us. We have the bias to identify problems. We're just going to use that to our advantage. And we're going to think about it in a sense of, I can't even forget this problem. Because here's the honest truth. If we don't own it, then nobody will. Everybody's been put in a specific place at a specific time to see a problem. If you see the problem and you don't do anything about the problem, what happens? You are the problem. That's the truth. All right, next thing, step 2. Don't forget about it. This is my biggest issue for me personally. When I see a problem, I'm like, oh man, that's got to get fixed. I feel the authority and the ownership mentality to do something about it, but then I walk away and I totally forget about it, right? So get something in place, a notepad, tell a friend. We have a lot of systems in place that allow us to write things down, communication log, to put that in some type of a feedback system to where somebody knows about it. So you can write it down, you can remember it to communicate during a huddle, but if we don't remember it, that is the number one reason problems persist, not because they're identified, but because they're not remembered. And we'll see it every time. And then it becomes just part. Think about how many times you found yourself answering a question like this. Hey, is such and such not working? It's not. How long has that been a problem? A long time. So what happened there? Something broke, somebody identified it, and eventually we got numb to it because it just became the way it is. We can't think like that. if it's a problem, we have to do something about it and remember to do something about it. Otherwise, it becomes the camera in room one, right? Just down all the time. Works perfect now. So, like, talked about the tactics. And last, I'm going to give you a new little tool here. It's something called a miracle question. This is not my concept. This is a concept from Harvard Business Review. But when you see a problem, even if it's a problem that's difficult to fix, what you're going to do is ask the miracle question. Here's the miracle question. If this was fixed overnight, what would be the outcome? That totally takes the onus off of you to identify how to fix it. Sometimes we don't even lean into problems because we don't even know where to start on fixing them. So we're like, ugh, I don't even know what to do here. So some of that stuff's really easy, right? The camera in room one's not working. What would it look like if it was fixed? It'd be working, right? That's an easy one to answer. More difficult ones are going to be things like there's a communication deficit between the admin and the clinical staff. I'm not saying that exists. I'm just saying if that was a problem. That's harder to fix. That's harder to identify. What is it exactly that would be fixed in order to make sure that's working? Once you identify what the answer to that miracle question is, then you can work backwards and start to fix it and get other people involved. We use a stepwise approach to things when we're trying to make new systems. It's called Build, Measure, Learn. This is from a lean startup. Have an idea, measure the idea, and learn from the idea. Don't do this alone either. Identify a problem, own it, answer the miracle question, and then build, measure, learn. Get with somebody else and say, hey, how can we, here's I think what I want the result to be, here's how we can implement that. And don't forget to run through this process. If somebody brings you a problem and you're in middle management, or somebody's dialoguing a problem with you, say, all right, what's the answer to the question? What ideas do we have? How can we measure the outcome? And what are we going to learn from that? 3 steps. What are we going to do? What are we going to measure? And what are we going to learn? Okay. Last little exercise here. I want you to take a couple minutes. And I wonder if we have a 2-minute timer here. No. I want you to take a couple minutes here and answer these 2 questions. See if I can. What's one problem you've noticed but forgot about? Question number 2. What's the miracle answer? What's the answer to the miracle question about that problem? Take 2 minutes, and then I'll pray you out, all right? And